Well, let's get started. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's nice to see people in a room. We're starting to do more of these events again here in our beautiful new event space at the Carnegie Endowment. I know we have a pretty robust online audience, even in the post-pandemic world. People still like to be online. So to them, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies here at Carnegie, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States agreement that is broader than, but among other things, is designed to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. So we're joined by a terrific panel. My colleague, Ash Townsend, who's Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Security, and an Australian himself who's had a lot to say about this subject. Stacey Pettyjohn from the Center for New American Security, where you lead the defense program, formerly the RAND Corporation, and Bill Greenwald, formerly Department of Defense, U.S. Senate, now with the American Enterprise Institute, Senior Fellow, long history of work on the National Technology Industrial Base here in the United States. So you all know about AUKUS. About 18 months ago, three leaders, two of whom are no longer in office, President Biden, who's still in office, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia, and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, to the surprise of many, suddenly announced this deal, which they called AUKUS. Their successors in two of the three cases, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of the Australia and the UK respectively, have recommitted to that and got together on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, and had another round of big announcements after 18 months of study and review. So what we want to do for the next 60 minutes is talk a little bit, first about what AUKUS is and isn't, second, what the potential is, but then third, about some of the pitfalls and challenges, because there are pitfalls and challenges. This is not just a submarine agreement. More broadly speaking, it is a technology sharing and interface agreement. And that part of this is more interesting to me in many ways, but also more challenging in many ways. And then there are associated initiatives like force posture related initiatives, some of which figured in the announcements on Monday too. So that's what we're going to do. And Ash, I thought I'd start with you, and maybe let's just presume for a second that not everybody has dug into the details on AUKUS. I was wondering if you could start by talking to us a little bit about what AUKUS is, what it's designed to do, and particularly to set it into the alliance context. I mean, what I love about the U.S. Australia alliance is how bipartisan it is. I mean, it's certainly true in Australia. I mean, if you think about it, we had Penny Wong here, the foreign minister, in December, where she gave a big policy speech. And she pointed out that both parties in Australia like to claim the alliance as their own. John Curtin, the great Labour Prime Minister, talked about the turn that Australia was taking from the UK to the United States during the Second World War, so that's Labour's claim. Then Prime Minister Robert Menzies, of course, with the ANZUS Treaty. So the Liberal Party makes a claim on it too, and it's very bipartisan here. And in fact, on Capitol Hill, for example, as we were just discussing in back, Congressman Mike Gallagher on the Republican side, Congressman Joe Courtney on the Democratic side are shepherding a lot of this through the Friends of Australia and the AUKUS caucus, I guess we're calling it the AUKUS caucus. So it's very bipartisan. There's a lot of support for this thing. And in that context, when the new Labour government came in, they recommitted to this, and I think to the surprise of many of their, well, not many, some of their base voters have really doubled down on this in ways that are quite significant. The Prime Minister's been tweeting the last couple of days about jobs for Australian welders and so on. So why don't you set a scene for us, talk a little bit about what it is and isn't, but also set it into the context of Australian politics and the alliance.
Sure, thanks, Evan. So your introduction is I think, a good scene setter, because AUKUS is often misunderstood. It was announced in September 2021, and it was initially bandied around, in the media at least, as a security alliance. That Australia, Britain, and the United States had just forged some new security alliance that would be for operational military activities in the Indo-Pacific, and that's exactly what it's not. AUKUS is not a security alliance. Both pillars of the AUKUS arrangement, if you like, when it comes to the countries involved, the two bilaterals are obviously treaty alliances, but AUKUS itself is not a treaty alliance when it comes to strategic policy. AUKUS is organised in two main ways, but those ways come together to, I think, give expression to what in the United States is, if you like, the alliance and partner agenda of the National Defence Strategy and of US strategy more broadly, which is integrating close allies and partners more deeply into the United States, defense industrial base, into the United States, broader posture and warfighting initiatives in the region. But the objective of AUKUS itself is really limited to the defence industrial elements of that. So what are the two pillars of AUKUS? First, as you mentioned, there is the submarine piece. The submarine piece is generally well understood, and part of the reason I think the Labor government has continued to support the AUKUS arrangement is it's not every day that a country offers to give you nuclear-powered submarines. It happens once a century, and this is the second time that it's ever happened. It happened first for the Brits and now for the Australians. It's a capability that will allow Australia to do a lot more with its submarine fleet. We don't have to get into those details today, but a lot more with its submarine fleet than it can with air-breathing, conventionally powered submarines. But the Pillar 1 arrangement, which was announced on Monday, was all about how do we get Australia nuclear-powered submarines in a timeframe that is strategically relevant, both in terms of getting Australia the submarines before our existing Collins-class fleet begin to be retired, and also getting Australia the submarines at the speed of relevance insofar as assessments about the deteriorating regional balance of power is concerned. So that was a narrow, if you like, although very important objective of AUKUS, the Pillar 1 initiative. The Pillar 2 initiative is more interesting, as you say, and that's really about defence industrial integration in two, I think, key ways. One, it's called the Advanced Capabilities Pillar, and it has several areas of priority interest, from hypersonics and counter-hypersonics to electronic warfare to advanced cyber capabilities to other underwater autonomous systems, and there are others, but it's zeroed in on a few niche areas of emerging advantage when it comes, or potential advantage when it comes to military capabilities in 21st century conflict, and the role that they can play, if you like, asymmetrically as giving the U.S., Australia, Britain, although not in the Indo-Pacific necessarily, an advantage, a way of dealing with the increasing problem of Chinese military power and long-range capabilities. The second part of Pillar 2, if you like, is about mixing up our defence industrial bases, our technology sectors and our traditional defence sectors in ways that allow us to seamlessly collaborate, which is something that we have never been able to do before. Now, we'll talk more about this, but in the sense, in terms of Pillar 2's primary value as an AUKUS construct, it is about giving expression to the part of the US defence strategy that says we will incorporate allies and partners into every stage of defence policy, from defence industrial collaboration right through to warfighting. AUKUS zeroes in on that very first stage. If it's successful, and I think there are a lot of problems, but if it's successful, that Pillar 2 initiative will fuse our defence industrial bases and will also drive some kind of reform agenda that brings in the technology sectors of our respective economies and industrial bases that have become increasingly unwilling to work in the national security space because of the problems and the burdens of engaging in that space. Okay. So that's what AUKUS is.
Okay, so I want to dig in on these three pillars a little bit. The submarine, we'll do a little side detour to the force posture initiative, and then I want to go into the technology sharing. But before I do that, I do want to ask you a question about Australian politics. How, there's been a little bit of sniping from former prime ministers on both sides of the aisle. Malcolm Turnbull on the Liberal side, although that's dissipated a little bit. And some of that was legacy sniping, I get it, because of the deal he struck with the French. And then in the last few days from Paul Keating on the other side of the aisle. How inevitable was it that the Labor government would embrace AUKUS to the degree that it has? How much dissonance is there in Australian politics on either side, either the coalition side or on the Labor side? Is it relevant at all, and should Americans pay any attention to it?
The political consensus in Australia around AUKUS and the alliance is rock solid. Okay. There are fringes in both parties, and you've identified some of those. There are other fringe perspectives on both the right and the left that, for different reasons, have an axe to grind when it comes to the AUKUS arrangement, or in some cases when it comes to the much longer-standing process of alliance integration between Australia and the United States. I mean, really not to, AUKUS is often misperceived as somehow coming out of the ether to bring Australia and the United States together in ways operationally, strategically, industrially, that they weren't already. Now, it is trying to deepen that integration, but you go right back to 2010 and you see since then a long-standing process that's really accelerated in the last 5 years of Australia and the United States deepening their posture cooperation, yes, their defence industrial cooperation, even though there are still problems there, their strategic alignment, and it's motivated by a shared assessment that the regional balance of power is deteriorating. Chinese capabilities are rising rapidly. Chinese intentions are an unknown, but they don't look good from where we sit. And US capabilities by themselves are insufficient to deal with that changing equation. And so to put this into a broader context, if you like, and where I think the Australian political consensus is supporting an agenda of collective defence, of integrated defence in the US parlance in the region that moves from an order in which the US unilaterally upheld the balance of power and all of the attendant burdens of that, to one in which countries, especially Australia and Japan, need to play increasingly frontline and regional roles in collectively upholding that balance of power, without which there won't be a balance of power. That agenda, I think, is very well supported in the Australian government. I think it is often poorly understood outside of government, insofar as people seem to think that AUKUS is somehow new in that context. AUKUS is an acceleration of that, but it didn't start the process.
Okay, good. All right, so now let's start to dig in a little bit. So I thought we'd start with the submarine, and then we can move on to the other pieces. So Stacey, I want to start with you. Monday had big announcements on the submarine. Refresh for everybody exactly what was announced, but then quickly transition to talking a little bit about how feasible you think this is, where the risks are, where the pitfalls are, and what the next few years are going to look like in terms of developing that.
Sure. It was a complicated announcement on Monday, but a very momentous one. I'm going to try to be quick, but as I thought through this, I realized you have to think about each of the 3 partner countries that are party to this agreement, and then timeframes, because the agreement extends over several decades. So I broke it down into the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, what they announced was really a big posture change, where Australia is going to make investments in a naval base in the western part of the country, Perth, and that will support a Western rotational force of nuclear-powered attack submarines that are American and British by 2027. And that's a fairly significant development that will allow an increased presence not only in East Asia, but also the Indian Ocean. So that's a big deal. The next step is to get Australia nuclear-powered submarines as quickly as possible before the Collins class have to be retired. And that is going to entail Australia buying at least 3, up to 5 American used Virginia-class SSNs. And as a part of that, the U.S. is going to have to expand its shipbuilding capacity to make up for that and be able to actually support the build of the SSNs while it's also building its own SSB and its nuclear-armed submarine. And the long-term piece is really where the Brits play a significant role, and that is where they're going to use their design for a nuclear-powered submarine, the SSN AUKUS, that is going to have embedded in it American technology, including vertical launch system, the tubes that allow it to fire cruise missiles. And Australia is going to build and purchase that, so it's going to be built jointly in the UK and Australia at the same time, and result in a submarine fleet where they have Virginia-class submarines and then the new SSN AUKUS. So there's a lot of moving pieces in there, and as you think about it over those timeframes, I think there are different costs and risks across the different partners. Up front, Australia has to bear a lot of the costs. They're making investments in US and British industry to help expand shipbuilding capacity. They're going to have to make investments in training and learning about nuclear propulsion and how to maintain and operate these systems safely. The U.S. is going to be potentially one of the biggest beneficiaries with this expanded presence and posture in the region that will help to make its presence in East Asia more resilient. Right now, U.S. SSNs rely entirely or mainly on a base in Guam. which we all know can be targeted by Chinese long-range missiles. So having another rear base that's fairly far away and another potential hub for operations is really significant. And the Brits get to be part of and enact their Pacific tilt in some way. They're going to have at least one boat that is going to be forward as a part of this rotational force. Over the medium term is where I think it starts to get complicated. Australia is the beneficiary and gets to purchase the SSN, so they're going to get the Virginia-class submarines, a very, very capable boat, but one that has large manning requirements and is going to be a little bit challenging to figure out how to operate. I think the bigger issue potentially for Australia is on the political side and what expectations there are in Washington. Because the U.S. is going to be taking boats out of its current fleet to give to Australia, my guess is there are going to be some expectations about Australia being there when it needs it in certain contingencies and scenarios, in particular Taiwan, that Australia has not necessarily committed to. The U.S., I think, is taking some risk in the medium term. It's reducing the size of our biggest asset, our undersea fleet, in that window when people are really worried about the balance starting to shift, and where China might think that it has the capability to undertake some sort of forcible unification with Taiwan. But the potential big benefit is that you're strengthening deterrence. And a lot of this is through this combined capability that you have. And then hopefully the signal of resolve that you're showing that this would be a united front that China would have to face, and that is enough to deter it. In the long term, I think it gets more complicated for Australia because they have to operate two different types of submarines that are nuclear powered simultaneously, which are going to have different maintenance and training requirements. There's going to be a big benefit of shipbuilding in Australia in the latter phase. But there is a significant price tag. We don't know exactly what it is, but the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that are being quoted over the 30 years is a lot. And I'm not sure they're going to actually achieve much in terms of economies of scale by buying two different types of boats. I think for the U.S., the long-term concern is industrial base, how it sustains its shipbuilding capacity that's going to expand. If it is able to produce the extra boats that are needed for Australia, how does it sustain that going forward, thinking about the next generation of SSN, which also gets more complicated because of something in Pillar 2, which is the unmanned underwater vehicles, which are likely to be maturing in this time frame. And then the Brits get some efficiencies by, having another country that's buying their new version of their designed SSN, and they'll get an upgraded fleet. So it's a really sort of complicated balance sheet. Sorry, I wasn't succinct at all. But there are a lot of moving pieces, and I think it was this complicated for pragmatic reasons and political ones, and hopefully those political factors help to ensure that people follow through on it because...
Right. Okay. Yeah, Bill, I actually kind of want to ask you the same question, but you're spared having to provide the background now because Stacey did it in such detail. But I really want to drill in on that question of risks and feasibility.
Yeah, no, I think there are a couple areas of risk that Stacey mentioned that we can get into a little bit more. First of all, the U.S. and shipbuilding industrial base is incredibly fragile right now.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Congress has been trying to increase the number of submarine production since at least the last 10 years. And we're up to now 1.2 boats a year, okay? And there's just so many constraints and capacity problems that are there. And the issue is now we're going to, we have the Columbia class we're putting on. Now we're going to put this on. Yeah, it's 10 years, 15 years down the road, but there's some real concerns. And I think that's going to drive political concerns as well. And Ash mentioned, there was actually one other time where nuclear submarines were offered to our allies. And that was 1988 when President Reagan offered 8 to 12 nuclear submarines to the Canadians to patrol the Arctic. And the outcome from the Senate at the time, my former boss, Senator Warner, was very similar in the concerns that the letter from Senator Reid and Senator Inhofe about the industrial base, about the ability of the Canadians to handle this, about so many other things. So there's and then of course the U.S. Navy at the time was incredibly opposed to this. President Reagan kind of surprised everybody. So now the Cold War ended, Canadians didn't need it, and that whole issue went away. But there might be some lessons learned there. So I think there's a political potential there, particularly as Stacy mentioned, when the U.S. is now on a downslope in operational submarines, not an upslope. In the fit-up, we're probably going to see fewer submarines on station than we have today, and that's a real issue.
What's the reaction? And the Navy, I mean, it's interesting what you said about the Navy with the Canada example. The Navy's largely on board with this. It's not just salute and say, yes, sir. It's more of an embrace of AUKUS. Am I correct on that?
I hope that's the case.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not correct on that.
I thought the Navy was on board with the defense trade treaties that were negotiated in the 2006, 2008 timeframe. And if you might remember, the lists of technologies that were not to be shared were many of the technologies that are now to be shared. And so the question is, how supportive is the U.S. Navy in this idea, or are they coming there with their kneecaps broken and then essentially saluting and saying this is a great program? I don't know the answer to that yet.
You don't know the answer to that?
No, I do
Okay.
not.
Do you have a judgment on that?
I'm not sure.
You don't have a judgment on that? Oh, okay. So you decide to watch that space.
I think we should watch that space.
Okay. Let's talk about the posture initiatives a little bit. This is not the first rodeo for the U.S. and Australia on things related to posture. So I'm curious what you make of what came out of Monday. And also, I'm going to start with Ash because I want you to set it into the broader alliance context, since there's been quite a bit of talk about posture over the last few years.
Right. My mic's not working.
Ah, thank you.
So I've got to go. Is that working? We'll see.
Okay.
A bit like doing stand-up now.
You can stand up, you know.
So the posture initiative, I mean, I think the first point to make is that the posture initiative, as Stacey said, is by far the most important part of Monday's announcements insofar as strengthening deterrence and strengthening deterrence collectively in the short term is concerned. And the short term is really everywhere between now and the early 2030s. To bring 5 nuclear-powered submarines, 4 American and 1 British, to Stirling, to the submarine base in Western Australia, will, if that full complement is there at the same time, double the number of submarines west of the dateline, of attack submarines west of the dateline in one go. So it's a very significant lift, and when you consider it's taken, it was only in around early 2000s that the US brought submarines to Guam, attack submarines to Guam, and it took at least 5 years to get those numbers from 3 to 5 where they are now, and Indo-Pacific still wants 6. That's a very significant innovation. Now, provided those submarines, is not a fudge and they don't come from somewhere already in theatre. I mean, Guam has LA-class submarines, not Virginia-class, so they presumably can't come from Guam, at least currently. That's additive, and that's new, and that's significant. It's significant in the alliance context as well. In the alliance context, to rewind until 2011, when Australia and the US began doing force posture cooperation, which was formalised in the treaty in 2014, the only real stickiness at a sort of military operational level in terms of a structure were the joint facilities. Was Pine Gap, the sort of intelligence facilities in Australia that provided situational awareness and early alert and all sorts of things to combined forces. But beyond that, the US-Australia alliance was very different to alliances in Korea and Japan, where combined military planning, at least for the direct defence of those countries, was a big part of how the alliances operated. So beginning in 2014 and then really accelerating in the last 5 years, you've seen a series of posture initiatives that have kind of been hiding in plain sight begin to bear fruit. Now, late last year, there was a lot of attention where there was an Australian media program that did a story on the fact that Australia will host 6 US B-52s in Northern Australia, or 6 US strategic bombers. And earlier in the year, although with no attention, a far more significant thing happened in a sense, which was that Australia for the first time hosted a US bomber task force, which was a contingent of 4 B-2 bombers, far more capable aircraft than the B-2s, nuclear capable aircraft, part of the US global conventional and nuclear deterrence complex, were hosted in Australia. This is very new. And this puts Australia in a very unique situation now in the context also of the Submarine Rotational Force West, of being the only US ally in Asia that is hosting US strategic bombers and that will be hosting US nuclear-powered attack submarines. It's going to go well beyond that as well. And if you look at the last 3 OSMINs, the U.S. Australia annual ministerial dialogues, a process began that started at a working group level to start to begin to have very structured conversations around how force posture should evolve to achieve our collective deterrence objectives in Asia. And it's got to the point where in December last year, there was a formalization of enhanced cooperation areas, not just in the submarine maritime piece, and I think there'll be a surface component to that in time, not just in the Air Force piece with the B-52s and F-35s and other things, but also for Army, the Marines, which are continuing and have been there for some time, and importantly, for what's called logistics, sustainment, and maintenance. Now, that component, I think, which is both a standalone but also interlocks all of the others, is in some ways the most significant because it positions Australia as a country that is investing in, and the US is also investing in Australian infrastructure here, but investing in the infrastructure to sustain US and combined military operations in Asia from Australia. And that is a place that the alliance has never really been, or at least not since the Second World War. Australia hasn't been a location for the staging of US military forces. Now, Australia still has, and what won't change is our policy on no foreign bases in this country. These are all combined facilities, Australian bases. But it positions Australia as a country that, for the first time really, needs to be viewed as integral to the US kind of warfighting, the US approach to warfighting. It's a node in that it is to be counted on, and that is very new. New alliance structures are being born to govern that. We don't have combined military planning, but we will need to find ways to work our plans together in order to make these initiatives work. From the perspective of deterrence, and to end on this, to echo Stacey's point in a way, one of the things that makes this credible is not just that it disperses US forces and makes US more resilient in that way, not just that it brings more forces in theatre, but particularly with the inclusion of the British and also the Japanese in air pieces, when they're now being integrated into Australian posture arrangements, it puts skin in the game of multiple countries in one place. So this idea that if the US, if China rather were to target these facilities, or facilities, this is happening in other parts of Asia as well, these facilities with missiles in the context of a regional crisis, it wouldn't just be striking US assets, it would be striking a collective asset, one that implicates multiple countries, that would draw multiple countries in, presumably, and it's that specter of what we call horizontal escalation that is really something new and designed to strengthen the credibility of Allied resolve in, frankly, areas of the region where, militarily speaking, we might not be as well postured as we'd like to be.
Yeah, of course, there are a lot of assumptions backed into that. One, that the Chinese would be deterred in an actual warfighting contingency from striking those for that reason, and second, that some of the parties that you mentioned would come in those contingencies because they have political debates about that as well. Do you want to weigh in on the posture initiative, Stacey, at all before I move on to the tech?
Just briefly, I think Ash covered it really well. I think what is really notable about this is you're seeing a shift where the US and Australia together are actually focusing on capabilities that are relevant, and the sustainment piece, which is one of the big advantages of Australia, being a continent, being a little bit farther away from the worst threat. Previously, the Marines at Darwin, which has been a evolution and gradual expansion of their rotations in the north, has been great, but that was really because the U.S. didn't have a place to put the Marines. Guam couldn't hold them all. They needed to get off Okinawa. Looking at bombers or tankers or ISR aircraft and then submarines, and hopefully with the submarines, you're going to have the equipment needed to reload them, to resupply them, maybe stockpiles of torpedoes and missiles. And this starts to dovetail into Pillar 2 or related issues in terms of the alliance about co-production of different types of weapons.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's dig in on that a little bit. I mean, I said at the beginning that I thought the technology piece was more interesting, but it's also more fraught. And maybe I'm just reflecting the press coverage here because there's been a lot of critical press coverage of this. But every time this comes up, people talk about export controls. They talk about ITAR. I dealt with India at the end of the Bush administration when dealing with the release community was a lot of fun. You know what that's like, where I would have to explain that the President of the United States actually wanted a strategic relationship with India, and there was some part of that the release community probably ought to understand. But some of this is not just about resistance. It's about legislation. It's about ITAR. It's about changing the way the system is set up in the United States to accommodate what's needed for AUKUS. So talk about that. I'm going to start with Bill, I think, and then go to Ash. But talk about that. Talk about ITAR in particular, and talk about, I think, first, level of awareness, executive branch, but also Capitol Hill. But then also what the solution sets look like. Are there legislative remedies? Are there administrative remedies? How are we going to fix this?
I think ITAR, when looking at ITAR, I think we have to look at where the U.S. technological dominance is or is not anymore. Mm-hmm. And as ITAR developed, it essentially was created around a series of technologies that the U.S. created in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which were beyond any in the world. And so we put a box around those, so to speak. And this box was designed at a time when there was nobody else. We didn't have a near peer on these technologies. And as this technology has evolved over time, we have two things that happen. One, our allies are no longer just takers of technologies. Right. They're creators of technology, and frankly, in ways that are actually, in many cases, superior than what we're doing in our industrial base. And the second is probably even more important, is that the driver of technology in the last 20 years has not been the militaries of the West or of our adversaries, but the commercial marketplace. And ITAR does not work well with either our allies or the commercial marketplace. It is designed in such a way that when you come into contact with it, the U.S. government now controls everything through a process that you can term as the either ITAR contamination or ITAR taint or whatever that whenever a U.S. person touches that technology, it has to go back to the State Department for a mother may I. So what that does, incentive-wise, is it creates tremendous incentive for our partners, and particularly the commercial marketplace, to never deal with the Department of Defense and the U.S. government. And why is that significant? Because the vast majority of technologies in not only Pillar 2, but the technologies that the Chief Technology Officer of the Department of Defense says that we need to be superior in the future are out there in the commercial marketplace. So ITAR has to change. It has to be modified. It has to be discriminatory. Right now, it is not discriminatory. It is essentially applied equally across the world. Now, on a transactional basis, you can have some discrimination, but that there's a time factor involved in doing that. And right now, the way technology is moving, we don't have time, and we need to be discriminatory. And we need to figure out a way to incentivize the participation of not only our allies, but this vast commercial marketplace, which frankly is in the United States and in our allied countries.
So I realized I committed the cardinal sin of using an acronym without spelling it out. So ITAR, sorry. This is related to international traffic and armaments regulations. So I even spelled out AUKUS without using AUKUS. Sorry about that. I want to get to what the...
It could be a verb, too. You could be ITAR.
To ITAR. Yeah, we're going to ITAR. Could you... How is there a push on the Hill on this? I mean, I've been in meetings with members of Congress where this has come up. And as I was telling you beforehand, I've heard them basically say, no, look, we're aware of the problem. We're not stupid. We know what the problem is. But what's the role of the Hill on this vis-a-vis the executive branch? And how does awareness for people who are enthusiastic about AUKUS or about the alliances or about deterrence of you-know-who, how does that help move the needle on this?
Well, historically, Congress has been split. and the Foreign Relations Committees have deferred to a great degree to the State Department and DITSA in the Department of Defense. I think there's some change ongoing there, but inside the departments themselves, I think they haven't quite come to terms with this changing technological dynamics that are taking place. And so, therefore, they're continuously controlling what they know and not making changes and not being discriminatory because they fear for the national security implications of that. I think there are those in Congress who have been pushing. My former boss, Senator McCain, was pushing for these changes about 10 years ago, but to no avail because the Armed Services Committees who see what's happening out there don't control the Arms Export Control Act, which essentially drives the ITAR.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about what happens if this doesn't get fixed. And maybe I'll do Ash and then Stacey sequentially. From an Australian perspective and then from an American perspective, what are the downsides to not fixing this in the Pillar 2?
So if I can just add something to the table first,
Yeah,
because the problem is bigger than just export controls, right? From Australia's perspective, from the perspective of U.S. AUKUS champions, from the British perspective, there are really three. The export control piece has been well explained, but there are two others. One of them is information sharing. And that's really often a cultural barrier. There is a predilection. Excuse me, I got to do the stand-up thing again. There is a long tradition in the U.S. system of labeling everything not for foreign release, and it's in part a product of a concern about compliance costs under ITAR and other regimes. It's in part just a mindset about from the perspective of a superpower about the way it does business, but whatever its causes, it's alive and well. And when it comes to sharing information on military capabilities, on technology, brokering conversations between engineers, providing early information to allies about new technologies or capabilities or ways of getting involved in their co-development, quite apart from the export control issues, is this information sharing issue. If we don't know what's happening, if we don't know what's available, if we don't know where our niche capabilities could be helpful, then we can't be integrated, which is the objective of the US defense strategy. So when it comes to information sharing, this no foreign issue is a problem, and the solution to that's easy. It's released to AUKUS countries. Right. It's have a default mindset, which is we share this with Britain and Australia. You can keep it from everyone else. That's fine from the perspective of AUKUS. And we do this in the intelligence space. The Five Eyes intelligence relationship, by default, shares amongst those five trusted partners. And we have that information sharing problem in AUKUS. The other problem we have is one of technology sharing, right? I mean, there's an export control component to that. But when you look at technology release, things that Australia is going to procure through a foreign military sales or through direct military sales, it goes through a very, very long and cumbersome process within the Pentagon and across other agencies of giving everyone a say, of giving every part of the US system, every service and so forth, a say about whether or not there are any concerns of the release of this technology. Now, again, that makes a lot of sense 99% of the time for most countries. But when it comes to Australia and Britain, or to the US's closest allies from a warfighting and co-development of military capabilities perspective, that mindset just doesn't make sense. 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, it was announced that Australia would buy Tomahawk missiles from the United States. There is still not an FMS case. Presumably, somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, 900 people are still being asked if it's a good idea. And the frustrating thing about that is the answer is nearly always yes, particularly from those who wear uniforms that are consulted. But the time it takes to go through the process is crippling. So, they're the problems. What do we stand to lose from Australia's perspective if this doesn't get solved? I think the first point is about empowering Australia. Australia is the small player from a defence industrial standpoint in the AUKUS arrangement. Australia's, I would argue, primary interest or at least Australia Defence Force's primary interest in AUKUS Pillar 2 is getting capability and getting it quickly and fielding it quickly. So speed matters. We've got a big defence strategic review that's about to be publicly released. It was handed to government a month ago.
This is the Stephen Smith and Angus, that review.
That's exactly right. Commissioned by the new government last year, 2 former senior Labor defence leaders, done a review on essentially how Australia needs to bring capability to bear on its new strategic policy settings that were really unveiled back in 2020, which is this strategy about playing a bigger, more forward role in the region to defend Australia's interests in the region, not just Australia's continent, and to do so independently as well as collectively with the US and other partners. So if we don't get this right, we won't get the capability in a time frame of relevance, we won't be empowered, we'll be a less valuable US alliance partner in that regard, we'll be a less valuable military power. The second issue is if you don't get it right in terms of the defence industrial collaboration piece, what Australia has to offer, and Australia has a short list of world-leading capabilities in the technology space, sonar, the CEA radar, which is world-class, until recently, the Ghost-Bat air teaming system, which is now owned by the State Department through the reasons that Bill outlined, but it was a platform developed by the Australian Air Force to be an autonomous warfighting aerial vehicle. And there are others, quantum computing, a big strength of Australia's. This cannot be unlocked. This cannot become part of the collective pool. US niche technology can't become part of the collective pool, British as well, and we can't move at the speed of relevance in developing these new emerging capabilities as a group. And I think the third reason, and this gets us back to posture, and the points that Stacey was laying out earlier, is we won't be able to service and maintain and be agile in servicing and maintaining and working with US and coalition forces if it's all bound up by red tape. A lot of the restrictions that come through that come through export controls in particular, require Australia to submit retransfer or re-export authority requests to the State Department prior even to undertaking a military exercise with the United States, to say nothing of operations or exercises with other parties. When we want, or when industry wants to move capability, technology from one part of the country to another, if that depot hasn't been listed, it might need a re-export or a re-transfer authority. The paperwork is endless, the time it takes is extremely cumbersome, and it doesn't allow Australia to do a lot of things when it comes to maintenance and sustainment and overhaul of Australian or US capabilities, to say nothing of being in a position where we can stockpile or get access to weapons or building weapons in Australia through the sovereign guided weapons push to build missiles in Australia. These things are not possible with the regimes as they stand.
Is that peculiar to Australia? I mean, forgive my ignorance here, but is this not true of NATO partners and of NATO allies or of Japan, for example?
They have different arrangements, I believe, and in terms of Australia in particular, I know there are certain environmental laws that also complicate things.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I think it differs by country.
Okay, got it. So I'm watching the clock, and I want to get the audience in, and we have a couple questions online, but I want to ask you, before I do, kind of the same question, what do we stand to lose? But also, as you answer that question, why is this so hard? Because the stuff about ITAR, it's not just Australia. I mean, I sat, we had the US-India meetings, technology meetings, an initiative called ISET recently. I mean, and the Indians are all over the ITAR stuff. They say, you want to do ISET with us? We're going to have to talk about ITAR. And having worked with India on technology-related stuff and on the civil nuclear stuff 15 years ago, India's voice is often heard around this town on that. So given all that, they're hearing it from Australia, we're hearing it from the UK, people are hearing about it from India. Why is this so hard to do? Is it just culture? Is it inertia? Is it politics?
I mean, I think it's culture. I think it's bureaucracy and different bureaucracies and multiple ones. My understanding is on the Hill, even for the issue, it's not just foreign affairs and armed services. There are other committees that have interests, and they don't have as deep of an understanding of the national security issues. So it's, I think there are many reasons why it is very problematic, and it's just a deeply entrenched way of operating that requires lots of layers to change. So as to why this is important and why it can't fail, I'm going to sound a little dire here, but I think this is, if AUKUS fails, there is a good chance that the United States can no longer defend the liberal international order, and that it can be overtaken by challengers in terms of its military technological primacy. The National Defense Strategy calls allies and partners the center of gravity. And you always hear, you can go back to 2018, you hear a lot of words about this, how important it is. But I don't think that the U.S. has fully recognized that they cannot do this on its own. We're watching our force structure shrink. You need allies for posture reasons, but in reality, it's deeper than that. The U.S. is not in a position right now where it can deter both Russia and China by itself. And we therefore, there was a report I wrote with my colleague Becca Wasser. We argue that we have to find ways to combine in a meaningful way our capabilities with our allies and partners. And I think in the past 30 years, we've had all these multilateral alliances for all of our operations, but a lot of that has been for political show and less for the capability that they bring. It's been to show that it is not the United States acting alone. It's got an international support, and that's important. Here, we actually need combined capabilities, and we need to be able to do it together before a balloon goes up and some sort of crisis or war breaks out, because we're not going to be able to recoup and cobble together when you face an adversary as capable as China.
Okay, great.
Can I just have one quick add-on? And AUKUS will fail if Pillar 2 fails. Yep. And Pillar 2 will fail if we don't get ITAR reform. And there's another pillar, I would call Pillar 3, which is the traditional, how we're going to do co-production and things like that. Right. That will fail if we don't do ITAR reform. So if we don't get that, all of those bad consequences that Stacey's talking about are going to happen. And it all relates to just a bureaucratic process that's divorced from time and urgency. But the reality is, because Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 can deliver capability in the time that's needed, in the time of maximum critical danger, let's put it that way, that's important. The submarines are important too, but that's like way down the road. It's what can we do in the here and the now, the next 3 to 5 years? And that's what Pillar 2 is, and that's what I'm going to call Pillar 3.
Okay, well, that's a pretty stark and, if I may say so, dire assessment. All right, I'm going to give the audience a crack at you. So if you have a question, the mic will come around. I know there's one over there, but while you're walking over there, I have 3 questions from the online audience, and they're basically variations on the same theme. And that theme is either countries that want to get into AUKUS or countries that don't like AUKUS. So if I can broaden the question and be editorially liberal here, we've got countries like Malaysia and Indonesia that Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Wang had a very long call list, I saw, so did the Defense Minister Richard Marles. They were very proactive about regional engagement. So we've got countries that are either uncomfortable or complaining. Fiji is apparently not in that category after the PM visited there. Then we've got countries like China that obviously is now complaining strenuously. There's a question here about Russia in the Pacific. And then I've got a series of questions about people everybody wants into AUKUS. What about India and France? We'll call it INFRAS. What about Indian Ocean littorals? I guess, the Maldives wants in, some of the smaller island states. Why don't we just take this question broadly construed? I'm going to hurl it to Ash. Address for a second those who don't like this, those who are not actively opposing it but are kind of a little sour about it, and then this thing about JAUKUS, INFRAS, everybody wants into this. What are we to make of all that?
So look, I'll take the second first. It would be deeply unhelpful for any other country to join AUKUS right now.
Okay.
If it can't work between Britain, Australia, and the United States, it can't work, period. Bringing other countries that have even more different, and in some cases, less well-developed information security regimes, or with less clearly defined alignment in policy preferences, defense policy preferences with the United States, will only make it harder to change already very hard to change minds. The overseers of everything we've been discussing that are very hesitant to make it work even for Britain and Australia. So I think adding others is just not sensible at this point in time. I think from the perspective of the broader alliance and partner collective effort down the line, yeah, I mean, ideally you want a way to bring a country like Japan into this and to work with Japan and Australia and Britain and the United States, for instance, on building long-range precision-guided weapons, for example, or some of the other advanced capabilities. But until we have proof of concept and this thing is working amongst the three-headed hydra, I think the time is not right. When it comes to the critics, I mean, I guess all I would say to that is that the Australian government, the Albanese government, this AUKUS announcement round, has been assiduous in its briefing of regional countries in ways that the previous government, wasn't for the first round of AUKUS's announcement, but also couldn't be because this thing was so tightly held that very few people were aware of it until it dropped. It was almost impossible to brief regional countries until a few moments before the announcement. In terms of how much it matters that there are criticisms in certain places, look, Indonesia is critical for Australia. Indonesia is in many ways the most important Southeast Asian country because of its size, its proximity to Australia, its non-aligned strategic culture. And the uncertainty about its direction, its trajectory as a regional actor in the future. So for Australia, it's one of the most important Southeast Asian countries, probably the most important strategically. Ensuring that we are working with the Indonesians on all of this, not bringing them into AUKUS, but consulting them, having them involved in force posture arrangements, etc., is important, and it's something which has been happening. Australia has been integrating Indonesian forces in exercises using U.S. Australian facilities in posture arrangements for a long time. This year, for the first time, Indonesia will host U.S. strategic bombers. That's a fairly big sign. So when you look at some of these countries and you look at where the criticism comes from, in the case of Indonesia, I think cautiousness around this, and then you look at what's happening in the defense parts of those countries as well, it's not always the same thing. So sometimes the protestations that you get from certain regional countries are because they need to be seen to be not supporting this diplomatically, even as other parts of their national security systems are working with the US and Australia much more quietly but effectively.
That's true. Although you and I were at the Shangri-La Dialogue last July, and we heard the Defense Minister, Mr. Prabowo, get up and give quite a stem winder of a speech. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do. It's on the IISS website, because he may be the next president of Indonesia. And so it's interesting to get a sense of his strategic view, which is not exactly, at least as he expressed it, the way Ash just described where Indonesia would be positioned. Okay, so I'm going to go down here, and if you can identify, I'm going to go here first, then to you, Jada, and then here. But let's start here, and if you can identify yourself, please.
Hi, Isaac Carden from Carnegie Endowment here in the Asia program, and I'm Senior Fellow for China Studies, so I'll defy expectations and ask a question about China here. And I'll sort of wave my hands at all the very sophisticated and very helpful analysis that you did of all the risks and complications and processes that need to happen for this to work. But let's just assume that away. Let's assume it works. Help us understand the intended strategic effects on China of a fully consolidated AUKUS system, however we want to think about that. And in particular, I'd be interested in your thoughts at how this strengthens our, quote, integrated deterrence. What's the mechanism of that? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts also on kind of the strategic informational level of what does this have to do with China's whole narrative about America's Cold War alliance system and its hegemony in Asia and all these things. How does it fit into that? And then finally, maybe just sort of an apples to apples comparison, and this may be more for you, sir, at the end of like, what kind of capability does this really buy us net? Obviously, we're transferring it around, we're spreading it around. This is one of the critiques I've seen in China is there's a finite amount of shipbuilding out there. The tech is already resident, so this doesn't fundamentally change anything. And I'm curious how that feeds back into deterrence. Is there some thinking that just more capability equals more deterrence? And if so, I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
I was going to bundle questions, but since you had three in there, I'm just going to bundle the three questions from the one, and then I'm going to bundle the next set together. So let's start. Who wants to take a crack at that?
Well, I'll take a crack.
All right, let's start with State. Let's just go down the panel.
U.S. undersea capabilities and attack submarines are one of the greatest advantages that the U.S. military has right now, and one of the biggest deficiencies that China has. So this is notable and significant. I think that it will take time to actually expand the capacity, right? There's a bit of a trade where the U.S. is going to give boats, or Australia is going to purchase boats from the United States, but then is planning to replace them. And then the U.K. will have. So part of it is on, actual capabilities. But then the other piece is the political side and the sort of showing credibly that they're thinking about taking steps to defend their own interests and to uphold sort of the liberal international order. So from my perspective, it helps on both of those pieces of deterrence that are really important.
Okay, let's go to Bill, then Ash.
The democracies only have so much STEM talent, engineering and scientific talent. And AUKUS provides the opportunity to bring together on some of these new emerging, potentially disruptive technologies that are not being used today. Submarines are extremely important and so on, but in the emerging tech areas, pooling our resources and adopting those technologies to military means in a near-term, urgent manner. If we can do that between the closest allies, the AUKUS allies, we should be able to expand that aperture out to the next level of allies, whether they're the NATO allies, Japan, Korea. And the key thing is how to break and cut down this Gordian knot of bureaucratic barriers to working together to achieve disruptive innovation, to achieve disruptive capabilities. That, to me, is what AUKUS is all about. The next level is, can we get the Australians building precision-guided munitions? I hope so, because we need a lot more of them. And we can do that if we reform ITAR and start making the investments and going down forward. So in those two areas, emerging tech and current tech, but that needs to be expanded in the industrial base, that should provide capabilities to deter our adversaries, whoever they may be.
Ash, are you burning to add anything to?
Bill actually took the exact 2 points I was
so
going to
you're not
make.
burning.
So
Okay, good. Then I'm going to bundle two questions together. I had one here and then one here.
You've done it more eloquently.
Jada Frazier, I'm a grad student at Georgetown, and I promise I'll be brief here. I wanted to pick up on a comment that Defense Minister Richard Marles made of Australia that really grabbed headlines here in D.C. on this idea of AUKUS pushing this movement from interoperability to interchangeability. And my question is, what does that look like in practice? And then will we see this reflected in changes or evolutions to roles and missions within the U.S. Australia alliance?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to bundle one more, so hold that question. And if you can identify.
Yeah, thanks very much. Ian McGilvray from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Look, my question's focusing more on the domestic aspect, and it was mentioned by the panel, it's a significant cost for the submarine program. Forward estimates are around 368 billion Australian, that's about 245 USD. That's just not a drop in the water that's going to have a huge impact on defense spending and, of course, on the Australian deficit. Prime Minister Albanese put forward there's about 20,000 jobs over 30 years that are going to come from this. But what is the panel's thoughts? And maybe Ash could help in this one. What's your thoughts? What do you think the government can do to sell this a little bit more? I feel like the narrative hasn't been very strong, obviously because of the kind of transparency around it. What do you think the government can do in Australia to kind of sell this a little bit more to the Australian public?
Beyond just the PM tweeting about jobs for welders in South Australia. Okay, so I actually have a lot of questions, but we don't usually like to run over, but I'll run maybe 5 minutes over. So who wants to take these? Why don't you take Jada's, then you take that one. Okay.
Interchangeability, I think I first heard it from the British CDS using the term, and this is really going beyond mere interoperability, where you have not only compatible equipment, but equipment that can use the same spare parts, that can use the same munitions, and people who can operate it, right? And operate it at the same level of proficiency. So this is really where you don't have to think about a British submarine and American submarine as providing something different. They'll both have torpedoes, they'll both have missiles, they both can conduct anti-submarine warfare and do it at the same sort of level. And then hopefully you have that mutually supporting logistics space which we've seen with the demands on consumption of materials, how they break, and munitions in Ukraine, that it's really, really important to be able to support each other as things wear down and are used up.
Okay, Ash, you want to take the domestic question?
Yeah. I mean, and just to add to Stacey's, I mean, so what does that look like? I think you asked. I mean, it looks like a US or a British submarine in Australia being replenished by Australian ground crews. It looks like a US strategic bomber arriving in Australia, being rearmed by Australians, refueled by Americans that are on the ground, doing so in ways that are nationality agnostic. And in some ways, we've achieved this in the Middle East, right? The Australian wedgetails were embedded in the air component in the air war over Syria, for example. They were sending data to Blue Force, and it was integrated. It was seamless. It didn't matter who was the shooter that day, that hour of the day. It was able to plug and play, which I think is another way of expressing it, with the rest of the coalition there. But doing that in an alliance context to give expression to the posture initiatives and in a seamless way is, I think, the objective. When it comes to how can the Australian government sell this domestically, look, I mean, it's a big ask, as you say. We're going to bump to close to 2.5% of GDP on defence because of the submarine deal alone. The cupboards are fairly bare for Pillar 2 as a result of this, and I think that's a concern. But I think selling it domestically really comes down to two things. I think the jobs component is still first and foremost, and people have lamented, friends of ours have lamented the lack of a more economies of scale leveraging arrangement in the Monday submarine announcement. But the political realities, the realities of jobs in all three countries mitigated at some level against that. What also mitigated against it was the need, from Australia's perspective, for a sovereign defence industrial base and sustainment capacity for the submarines. So I think those job aspects are important. If you look at Western Australia and the announcement for $8 billion to refurbish HMAS Sterling, if you look at Darwin and the support locally for the posture initiatives, for example, that support is primarily based on the economic advantages that come as a result of that. The same is true for South Australian shipbuilding. So I do think that's the main argument. Second, though, it is probably true that many people ask questions about what the strategic case for AUKUS is. I think, broadly speaking, you've seen public opinion in Australia fall through the floor when it comes to attitudes towards China. You've seen strong and sustained support for the United States right through the previous administration to now. I think the Australian public are well primed to be supportive of this, defence strategic agenda, but it is not very well articulated. I think, for instance, the way that force posture and AUKUS initiatives intersect is not well explained. I think most people don't really understand what's going on in force posture. When you talk to them, they think it was happening anyway. So they're ready to be convinced, but I think that case could be made clearer.
Okay, so we're gonna end it with one question from the floor, and then I'll bundle it with two questions online, and then we'll call time. So please, and be sure to identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Lindsay. I'm a fellow at Carnegie in the nuclear policy program, but I do a lot of quantum policy, and so I've mapped the different quantum firms worldwide, and actually when you look at it, more so than any other country, the U.S. contributes a lot to the quantum industry in Australia. And so my question is on the ITAR thing that I've been thinking is, from a policymaker perspective, to what extent would reforming it just kind of highlight the differential collaboration that the U.S. is giving to Australia versus other countries, whereas if you keep it below the radar, then maybe you can risk not raising a new AUKUS submarine sort of PR issue. So I guess I'm just curious about, if we reform ITAR or any of these traits, like what level of advertisement do we even want to make about that? Because it seems like we might get into sort of...
You want to just take that, and then I'll ask the last.
Yeah, okay.
Why don't you take that?
So the key thing there is what type of quantum's being done. And if you talk to the quantum companies here in the United States that are making those investments, that are doing, they are ensuring, and they've lawyered up completely to ensure that nothing military is going to taint that quantum technology and that quantum cooperation, because they can't do anything with it. And so the key thing for us is to figure out, I think, as an alliance, is how can we encourage working on military quantum except just in a very narrow sense, in a broader area with as many STEM talent as we possibly can. And I think that's the problem here, is because, yeah, there is cooperation going on. It's going below the ITAR frame, and it's being done in such a way as not to be tainted whatsoever. So eventually that technology will get out in the commercial marketplace much more before it can be ever militarized. Not really a good thing when your adversaries get it before you do.
Okay. So I have one kind of industry and indigenous capabilities question from online, and then I have the perfect question to end on, so that's why I'm going to do that. Okay, so there's somebody named Martin Donegan, who's in the online audience, says, how much of an increase do you think having Australia build some of their own submarines will increase the construction of new tonnage capability in case of a conflict? In other words, more indigenous capability creates the potential, I think what he's saying is, for more ramp up in the case of a conflict. Is that, seems intuitive to me, but I don't know if you want to assess tonnage, but
I mean, without assessing tonnage, I think the idea, I mean, Australia builds submarines. The idea that Australia will one day build its own SSN AUKUS, and will in the process build out the collective industrial capacity of all three countries through some degree of investment, is a positive that will give you a pathway to that. But this idea of ramping up in a conflict, you can't ramp up. The nature of 21st century military technologies is not rampable. I mean, I think we should be looking at cheap, attributable, fast-to-produce capabilities, and Pillar 2 is a place to do that. That's rampable, but we're not in that place yet.
Okay. This is absolutely the perfect question to end on, because it was inevitable that somebody was going to ask this question. Ready? Is there a chance that AUKUS becomes the start of a new Pacific NATO, the Pacific Treaty Organization? And I love the borrowing from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Treaty Organization. Since the U.S. refuses to join the TPP under any political configuration in this country, that would imply that if you call it that, the chances are zero. But if somebody was going to ask this, the Chinese, of course, are accusing the three countries of this. So I think I know what you're going to say, but anybody want to answer? But maybe Stacey and then Ash.
What's the drive of that one?
No, I mean, I don't think.
I guess the question. Let's if we give the question more credence, is this the start of something more formalized that isn't just about submarines and technology sharing, but has broader implications for strategic architecture in the region? And then you can answer that partly by circling back to the question about incorporating other partners.
Yes, okay. I think it does. I think you're seeing a bunch of mini-laterals and multilaterals, and some of them include the U.S., some don't, among partners where they're deepening their relationship, and that is a good thing. I don't think it will necessarily result in some large collective security organization as formal, but you are seeing deepening cooperation in ways that hasn't existed before, and is a good thing.
Bill and then Ash.
Yeah, no, I think it has a great opportunity for being test cases for new paradigms for defense cooperation. That doesn't have to necessarily mean a larger organization, but I think if we can solve some of these cooperative problems, we can easily take that model and apply it to a lot of other different countries and expand the capabilities of all of the countries in the region. Go ahead, Ash.
So Ash, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'm going to end with an anecdote.
So I'll just divide it into two parts. On the defense industrial integration piece, I agree with Bill, and I think that the AUKUS has the potential, if it succeeds trilaterally, to include other trusted, aligned partners, and in so doing, it offers the opportunity to provide a response to China's military-civil fusion. This idea that in China, they have at their disposal of the Chinese government, every part of the technological industrial base. They can use it, they can integrate it, there is no red tape. It's something that we can't do either within the United States or across allied countries. So that's a big part, and that could be an architecture change of a type. But on the sort of military posture side of the house, I would say that AUKUS has a big sort of narrative target on it, and China and other countries in the region that are hostile to it are trying to situated as something new and different. But what Stacey talked about never began with AUKUS. This process of integration, of pursuing balance of power solutions collectively in the region has been going on for a long time. AUKUS is a component of that, but the posture initiatives, the role of Japan, the role of the Quad, the access arrangements that are now proliferating between those 4 Quad countries is an agenda that's been going on for a long time. It will continue. It is not what AUKUS is fundamentally about. AUKUS will enable that amongst 3 countries, but that process of integration has its own logic, and that logic, to go back to the beginning of all of this, is that the US can't uphold the Asian balance of power by itself. It needs to work with allies and partners, and if it doesn't, there won't be a balance of power in Asia.
Yeah, and I'll end with an anecdote that builds off that. So it's funny, you said this has been going on for a long time, but not such a long time. So Ash knows this, I'm on the advisory board of something called the Australian American Leadership Dialogue. And in 1999, when I was a fellow at the Kennedy School, the Leadership Dialogue sponsored an alliance review. And it was a review in the first instance of the U.S. Australia alliance, but it looked peripherally at the U.S. Japan alliance and the U.S. Korea alliance too. And the core idea that ran through the conclusion, which was published by the MIT Press, was that the United States ought to promote more coordinated alliances among its bilateral alliances. This idea was greeted with such horror that the Australian co-editor of the volume, who I will not name, you can check it, actually wrote a dissent and said, this is the most outrageous idea ever. More coordinated alliances, oh my God, these are separate bilateral alliances. This is not in Australia's instance. So if we circle back to where Ash ended and we think of AUKUS as a building block, albeit a technology building block, a military capabilities building block, in a larger process of building, let's call it architecture in the region, it is amazing how far this has come. And the strategic environment has a lot to do with that, but I also think forward-looking vision by politicians, by the strategic class, by the technology class, by others, on, as I said at the beginning, a very bipartisan basis, not least in the United States and Australia, has had a lot to do with that. So we got to talk about the AUKUS component of that. I'm really grateful to you guys, Stacy, Bill, Ash especially, my senior fellow colleague here at Carnegie. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to the online audience. And we'll see what happens. It's going to be an interesting next few years. Thanks for joining us.